Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. K, and today we are going to be talking about accounts and UTXOs and how we are using the different forms of recording in Quai Network. Before we get started, just want to give a little bit of context, right? At Quai Network, our goal is that we would like to onboard the next billion people into crypto, but to do that, we need to transcend the concept of finance, and we need to become functioning. We need to be able to function as money. To do that, we have to understand our scaling requirements, and we can look at card-based transactions, cash-based transactions, and come up with an estimate of needing about 50,000 transactions per second to have a blockchain-based system that can function as money. To accomplish this, we have a multi-chain architecture. So Quai is a hierarchy of merge-mined blockchains that allows us to dynamically increase throughput while maintaining security guarantees that are similar to something like Bitcoin. You can see here on the left, we have sort of a first-gen blockchain, which is just a sequence of blocks similar to Bitcoin or Ethereum. And then on the right, we have this hierarchy of blockchains, 3 levels, prime, region, and zone, with a dynamic ontology. So the number of chains can effectively change with demand. And let's dive into our use of accounts and UTXOs. But before we get there, we need to talk about 2 tokens. So in Quai Network, we are planning to have a 2-token system. And we'll just review briefly what sort of the characteristics of the 2 tokens are. So there's Quai and there's Chi. So Quai is a deflationary token. You can think of this as a sort of a traditional store of value, similar to something like Bitcoin or Ethereum in its tokenomics. Quai will have smart contracting capabilities, will be EVM compatible, and in this system, you can kind of think it as what we would call the preferred form of money. That means that this would be what you'd consider the store value. The block reward for Quai will be proportional to the log of the difficulty of the system over time, and Quai will be using an account model. So to do smart contracts in a generalized way, account models are easier to implement. And then when we talk about Chi, Chi is what we would call a quote-unquote inflationary token, meaning its supply will change, but the way that the supply changes is in such a way that it should have a stable value over time. So Chi effectively is going to be linked to the production of hash. And with that, we believe that over time in equilibrium, the volatility of Chi will reflect the volatility of the global average energy prices on a 1 to 3 year time frame. So that will create a token which is relatively stable. Now, that being said, you could think of this as the non-preferred or inferior form of money. So Chi will have its values tied to the value of energy. So the expectation is that it will be relatively constant with time. And the block reward for Chi is going to be based off the difficulty, which correlates to numbers of hashes produced per block. And it's that mechanism of linking the issuance of Chi to the number of hashes produced that allows us to link the value of Chi to the cost of producing a hash, which in turn then is dominated by global average electricity prices. And Chi will be using a UTXO based model. So with the sort of introduction of the 2 tokens, Quai and Chi, Quai again is going to be based off an account model, and Chi is going to be based off of a UTXO model. Now, for the astute listeners that are coming back, We've recently rebranded Qi, so we've previously referred to that as Q, but we have decided that Qi is a better name than Q. So moving forward, 2 tokens, Quai and Qi. Before we dive into the specifics of a little bit more about the technical level stuff, let's just cover kind of what the differences are of account and UTXO models at a very high level. When we think about accounts, the way they work is an address has a balance. So if I'm in Ethereum, I have this 20-byte hexadecimal code that is an address. Everyone's familiar with these. And the account model basically just records a balance of token against any given address. And TXs, or transactions, allow us to update the balance of one or more addresses. So if I have an address or an account that I control, if I would like to make a transaction, I usually sign a message. This could be a very basic transaction. It could be an EOA, an external account that just moves ETH, I guess in this example, from one account to another. Or I could have a more complicated transaction where I interact with a smart contract. But regardless of the type of transaction, if it's a basic transaction or it's a smart contract transaction, the net outcome of it is that one or more balances in the ledger will get updated. So, if I have address 012 and I want to send money to Max over there at address ABC, and I want to send him 1 Quai, let's say, my balance will be debited by 1 Quai and his balance will be credited. And we can think of this sort of use most akin to like having a bank account. So if we look at how banks work, banks effectively are just bookkeepers, right? So they have a ledger, everyone has an account, and accounts can be credited and debited, which then move balance from one account to another. So in an account model, it's very much like a single bank that has this ledger, and when an action takes place, the ledger updates. Now, if we look at unspent transaction outputs, or UTXOs, a UTXO is an object that's controlled by one or more addresses. And when we make a transaction, we actually destroy UTXOs and we create new ones. So we take an unspent transaction output, we spend it, and then we create new unspent transaction outputs. And in a UTXO transaction, we can have many inputs and many outputs. And a single address can control many UTXOs. So when I send money, say I have a single address, and we'll think about sort of Bitcoin. If I have a single address in Bitcoin and I provide it to 2 people send me money, I may look at my wallet and see, okay, I had 1 Bitcoin, and then now I have 2 Bitcoins because somebody sent me another Bitcoin, and it's controlled by the same address. However, what's really happened in that wallet is I have 2 different objects now. I have 2 UTXOs, both worth 1 Bitcoin. Now the wallet will abstract that from me, so I just see sort of the aggregate balance of 2, but I actually have 2 things, not 1. And the analogy to think about for UTXOs is they are most like cash and coin. So sort of the summary here at a high level again is account model is like a bank account, and a UTXO model is like cash. Digging a little bit deeper into how this technically works, if we look at the UTXO model, the UTXOs are technically a DAG, or a directed graph, and every UTXO that's created has an origin to a UTXO that was destroyed. And so if you look at this graphic, each one of these horizontal lines are what you consider a block or a state transition. And with each block, we get a series of transactions which update state. So on the left here, you can see we start out with 1 UTXO, UTXO 0, We do a state transition, which spends UTXO 0 and creates 3 new UTXOs at state n+1. And then that sort of progresses with time. But every UTXO that is created originates from a UTXO that was destroyed, which eventually originates from a Coinbase. Now with the account model, instead of having these atomic objects that reference back to each other, we just have an aggregate ledger, and we update all the balances in the ledger with state transitions. So in the account model, we sort of have account A here. It has a balance of 0. Account A decides to send money to account B, so we'll update the balance in A as well as B, and then the ledger sort of can progress in this way. So very much, again, like a banking ledger. So what does this actually look like from a transaction standpoint, or from what we would call a state transition? If we go through an example of the account model, we start out with 3 accounts. We have Alice's account, Bob's accounts, and just a generic contract account. So there's a total of 14 Quai in the system. And in this example, we're going to have Alice send 8 Quai to Bob. So Alice is going to create a transaction. She's going to sign it with the corresponding private key to the account that she controls that says, I would like to move 8 Quai to Bob's address. And with that, the EVM, or the state machine, will make sure that that's a valid transaction, that's a valid signature. And then what will end up happening is Alice's account will be updated. So in this case, debited 8 Quai. Bob's account will be credited with 8 Quai. And then the other accounts that weren't affected by the state transition won't be modified. So in the end here, Alice ends up with 2 Quai, Bob ends up with 9, and the contract account ends up with 3. So the process of an account-based transfer is that one account is simply debited and the other account is credited. When we look at the UTXO state transition, it's a little bit different. We really want to think about UTXOs as sort of atomic objects. For me, it's simplest to think about UTXOs as physical bills. So if I think of a UTXO as a $10 bill, or a dime and quarters and whatever that may be, that sort of is the most akin analogy, I think, to think about. So how does this work? When we start out with a UTXO state transition, we have 3 UTXOs in the system, 0, 1, and 2. They're controlled by 3 different people, Sam, Alice, and Bob. In this example, Alice would like to send money to Bob again, so she has 1 UTXO as an input in this case. And she would like to send Bob 8 Quai again, so she is going to destroy or consume UTXO 1, which is the 10 Quai, and she will produce 2 new UTXOs, 3 and 4, 1 going to Bob's address for 8 Quai, and then 1 going to back to her address for 2 Quai. So if you look at the end state of the system, we end up in the same state. However, if you compare this to the account model, in the account model, we only had 3 things, right? We had 3 addresses in the beginning, and we had 3 addresses in the end, or 3 accounts. In this particular case, right, we ended up consuming 1 UTXO and producing 2. So in the beginning we had 3, and in the end we have 4. So right, Bob's wallet now has 2 UTXOs. There's a little reversion here on the 8 and 2. But regardless of that, the point here is when Bob looks at his address, he'll see a value. It should be, in this case, 9 Quai, but that will be made up of a 1 Quai UTXO and an 8 Quai UTXO. So Bob now has 2 things, Alice has 1 thing, and Sam obviously remains unchanged. So when we have a UTXO, we're actually destroying an atomic object by a transaction, and we're creating a new one. So this can create some sort of cognitive difficulties. when we think about the fact that we have a single balance, I guess, but that balance is composed of many discrete parts. And we need to be able to manage those discrete units in a reasonable way. Now, if people have used Bitcoin before, they've used UTXOs, but they might not entirely be aware of that fact. But wallets that are built for UTXO systems report aggregated balances, and they also algorithmically decide which UTXOs to use. So if you have a Bitcoin wallet and you have 10 UTXOs and you want to send 1 Bitcoin, the wallet is going to go through and decide what is the best way to come up with 1 Bitcoin given the inputs that you have available. So it may decide to do that with a very large UTXO, say a 10 Bitcoin UTXO, or it may decide to do it with several small UTXOs. In most wallets, they'll try to get rid of your change first, because you don't effectively want to continue to sort of fracture the balance in your wallet, because then your wallet becomes a little bit more difficult to manage. And then over time, your transactions will become more and more expensive. So normally sort of the preference of a wallet is if you have small UTXOs, they'll put together several small UTXOs before sort of breaking out big ones. This is effectively what you can think of as a cashier problem when we're trying to do a transaction, sort of how do I make change? This obviously isn't something that is that hard to solve, because for the history of humanity, we've effectively been solving the problem where we have fixed denominations, we go to buy something, and through figuring out how to compose it with the money we have or get change from the cashier, we can effectively figure out how to do an appropriate transaction with appropriate precision. It does definitely become more challenging with discrete units, which is something that we're introducing in Bitcoin. You do not have technically you do have discrete units, right? A sat is a discrete unit, but a sat is on the order of 10 to the minus 8 Bitcoin. But also things aren't sort of limited to that discrete unit. So everything above 1 sat is available, right? So you basically have a uint 64 worth of different values that you can use within Bitcoin. So when I say discrete units, though, I'm talking about discrete denominations like you may have with coins and bills. Interestingly, within the US system, I think there's only 13 denominations, counting all coins and bills. What this does, though, and I guess the point is that although UTXOs can be a little bit confusing because they're discrete units, the wallets can easily abstract this to allow it to function just like cash or coin and sort of abstract or hide the challenge of creating precision in transactions. So what are some of the pros and cons of UTXOs? The pros are that we create fungible objects. To create fungible objects, which is sort of a requirement to be money, we need to have fixed denominations and we need to have incredibly limited programmability. And by incredibly limited, we are deciding that actually means 0 programmability. Not even time locks, not even multisigs. There will be a bridge mechanism between Q and Quai to allow Chi and Quai to allow the wrapping of Chi. And this will then allow the functionalities of time locks and multisigs, so on and so forth. However, within the UTXO ledger, if you want fungible objects, you basically can't have any programmability whatsoever. The thing that's nice about UTXOs is they create atomic objects. That's one of the things that we actually exploit to allow us to do cross-chain value transfers and interactions. They're much more efficient at parallelization. So if I have UTXOs, they have a much easier time computing effectively because you're not having sort of many input, many output state transitions that commingle, because effectively each spend shouldn't interfere with other spends in the set in a given block. Another nice feature is UTXOs don't necessarily require a state tree. So it's a little bit more efficient to compute, and they are much, much better at being proven, which allows much cheaper and simpler compatibility with any form of L2 or channel system that you might want to construct. Cons of UTXOs is that arbitrary programmability is difficult, even in sort of full-featured systems. If you look at Bitcoin or Cardano, they both use UTXOs, but even in Cardano, having a UTXO set for arbitrary smart contracts with an arbitrary set of participants is much more difficult than doing the same thing using an account model. And then the other con is that precisions can require multiple inputs and outputs. So you can get a little bit more bytes per transaction, even though the computations can be simpler. So UTXOs, in summary, have cache-like properties, but lose programmability. And I mentioned we use sort of UTXOs as a mechanism to do cross-chain transactions. We actually call these ETXs in our system. So everything that goes between the chains, you can think of as a UTXO rather than an account. And we can't really get atomic transitions between the contexts in a way that's synchronous because we have an asynchronous system. So we have to use something that in and of itself is atomic, and that is a UTXO. So every transaction that goes between chains is effectively a UTXO. Again, we call them ETXs. And we can kind of follow, why that needs to happen in an asynchronous setting is because we can't atomically complete an update that would reference to accounts without having an atomic object. So in this sort of example here, we have a transaction going from Cypress 1 to Cypress 2. We have a longer range transaction going from Paxos 2 to Cypress 2. And we're just going to kind of watch the progression of blocks, assuming that we're starting at a common time interval here to the left. And then we're going to watch this from the perspective of Cypress 2 as sort of blocks get mined. We see that Cypress 2 will eventually find these coincident dominant blocks. Those coincident dominant blocks will allow us to create an objective hash-linked reference between Cypress 2 and the origin, in this case Cypress 1, which will allow that transaction to be referenced. So if we were trying to do this with an account, we would need Cypress 2 to synchronously update with Cypress 1. Instead, what we do is we create this ETX object in Cypress 1 that now is atomic, that can then make its way to Cypress 2 and eventually do that account update. And then the other example, this is just interesting too from if people haven't seen this before, the difference between a close coordinate transaction and a far coordinate transaction. What I mean by that is a transaction that has a common region parent versus a common prime being the parent, or prime being the common dominant chain. So your far coordinate transactions take a little bit longer. So if we look at the transaction going from Paxos 2 to Cypress 2, we eventually have to mine this prime coordinate block. But again, we create a series of objective hash linked references through those coincident blocks. And this ETX that originated from Paxos 2 is now spendable in Cypress 2 at that block. Now, practical considerations for Qi and using UTXOs, right? We are wanting to make sure that things remain fungible so that we have cache-like properties. In doing that, we will be using fixed denominations. This is a list of fixed denominations that we have proposed. If people have comments on this, this is defined in the Quai Network repo under the QIPs or QIPs, and I believe this is QIP 5. So if people have any comments on the specifics of this setup or these denominations or anything like that, feel free to go to GitHub and make comments or create a pull request. In addition to fixed denominations, we also have the challenge of a signature problem using UTXOs for Qi. Right, we want Qi to be cache-like, which means we want it to have high throughput with low fees. Obviously, the fungibility aspect of this, having UTXOs with multiple inputs and multiple outputs, creates new challenges. One of those challenges that it creates is that we have many inputs. In a traditional Bitcoin-based UTXO system, every input would require one signature. So if we had 10 inputs, we would need 10 signatures. Signatures can be 70 bytes. And so your transactions can get pretty large, even if they're just simple sends. The way that we are sort of fixing that is we're going to use Schnorr signatures. So every transaction in the Qi ledger will have exactly one sig, and that sig will validate all the inputs effectively. So Schnorr signatures are pretty cool. They basically have this property that they're linear. So effectively you can add up the signatures and you can add up the public keys, and then you can verify that the addition or the summation of the signatures is correct for the summation of public keys. What that means effectively is that you can do signature aggregation, and you can also do batch verification. So not only can this make it more efficient to do a single verification on a single transaction with many inputs, but it could also allow you to verify many inputs going into a block all at once by doing addition rather than having to do point multiplication. And this allows UTXOs to be compact and more inexpensive than the account-based systems in Quai. Right, and there's sort of the structure of a Qi transaction. Effectively, you have inputs, and you can have an array of inputs, and you can have an array of outputs, but you'll end up providing only a single signature. And the goal of all of this is that fixed denominations and Schnorr signatures will allow us to create a fungible set of UTXOs. And with that, I'll go ahead and take questions.
I have a question. If I end up with like the very small UTXOs, like the smallest denomination you mentioned, is there any point where like I could end up with a UTXO at that denomination that's so small, like I can't send it? I guess my question is, how do fees work in UTXOs? Do fees become a UTXO of their own?
Right. So when you create a transaction, the difference between your outputs and inputs is your fee. From the perspective of a sender, that means that their fee will have to be a multiple of at least the base unit of UTXOs. So in this case, I think that's 5,000th of a Qi. From an output standpoint, though, all of the fees will be aggregated. So the number of and the size of the outputs, right? So let's say you had 4,000 transactions in a block and everybody paid 5,000ths of a Qi. You would end up with 2 Qi in total fees. Now, that Coinbase output could just be 2 Qi rather than having to be 5,000 individual Qi. So although there's fixed denominations, you can still make and break from those denominations. So if you have 100 Qi cents, so to speak, you can make 1 Qi from having 100 Qi cent inputs. So people can make their own change effectively and redeem their own change. And within Coinbases, you can do reaggregation of the UTXOs. So that's a great question. There's also going to be a forthcoming quip that deals with effectively what you might think of as like state rent for UTXOs. So there'll be some sort of expiry scheme that's based off time and amount. So if somebody were to come in and make 1 million sort of pennies, they would last for some period of time, but eventually they would get expired from state if they're not transacted. So that's a forthcoming quip. don't necessarily know if we want to dig into that too much more before we put the PR up for that, but something we're working on.
Yeah, if we get any questions about it, we can definitely dig in some more. But Kishore has some questions here that I'd love to jump on. The first one is Qi. The question is, Qi will be in any way related to the difficulty of the shard/chain then as the network grows. So I guess the question is, what is that relationship between the emissions of Qi and the difficulty of the network?
So Qi is an option for the miners. So when they get a block reward, they get to choose if they want to get rewarded in Quai or in Qi. The Quai block reward will be based on proportionality to the log of difficulty or bits. The Qi block reward will be based off direct proportionality to difficulty or hash. The idea there being that the miners will only want to produce or take Qi as a reward if the market price for Qi is higher than their production cost. And that's kind of how you start to tie the value of Qi back to the price of production of a hash, which is largely, again, dominated by electricity costs. So the emissions rate of Qi will always subtract in some ways from the emissions rate of Quai, because if someone chooses to mint Qi, they would be foregoing a mint of Quai. And the actual rate will be determined by the relative utility and value, as well as potentially future expected values that are anticipated in the market by the miners between Qi and Quai. So if people think that the difficulty of the network is going to go up over time, they may have a higher preference to mint Quai. However, if they think that fungible UTXO denominations with low fees are more interesting, maybe transactionally, maybe the stable-ish aspect of Qi is interesting to them, then they would have a preference for Qi, and then the market will mint effectively until that demand is met.
And then we have a nice follow-up question to that, which is, if Qi is inflationary, how will its value be relatively stable?
Right. So again, it's inflationary on that sort of option. And there's also then a mechanism in the system where Qi can be converted back to Quai at the prevalent difficulty. So you can kind of think of Qi as saved up hash that could go back to Quai at some point in the future. However, if the difficulty in the system rises and you want to trade your Qi back, you would be doing it at a higher relative rate, effectively. So
in simple terms, there's also like a deflation mechanism if that is what the demand is indicating.
Right. So let's say the price of Qi in the market is below the price of production of a hash with the proportionality constant of emissions, whatever that is. There would be a market opportunity for somebody to buy up Qi and convert it to Quai to make money effectively. And that would diminish the supply of Qi up into the point that the market price rises to again match the production price.
Got it. Another question we have from Kishore asks, like, the inter-UTXOs are ETXs effectively. How do we create the differentiation, or is there no need to?
So with Qi, the nice part about the system is because Qi is UTXO based, our treatment of UTXOs as ETXs is effectively just UTXOs. So it's a very simple system. With Quai, it gets a little trickier because effectively you're taking this thing that is natively account based and you would like to make a transition, so you have to hypothecate a UTXO or an ETX in this case to make the cross-chain transaction possible. And we already do that, and that's what we refer to as an internal to external transaction. So that's sort of the difference. So UTXOs in the multi-chain system are actually much, much easier than dealing with accounts.
Interesting. I see Kishore type in, so yeah, we'll let Kishore drop another question in. If anyone else has anything, feel free to throw it in the chat. I'm happy to answer anything about this. Bringing it back to what I asked before while I wait for Kishore to type this question. So, were you basically saying that like all fees will, like there's a limit to the fee market where essentially all fees will have to be denominated in one of the fixed denominations of Qi?
No, fees can be paid in either one, right? And then it's minor preference to sort of figure out what no, to be fair, there's always an exchange rate in the market, right? So the protocol always has sort of a predefined exchange rate that's based off the difficulty between Qi and Quai. So even with that, right, the sort of base fees can be held consistent across the two systems. And then mine transactions, the ordering will be determined by hash, effectively. So obviously that's universally consistent between the two different transaction types in a given block. So there's deterministic ordering across the two types, and then in terms of fees and calculation of base fees, given the difficulty as an exchange rate, so to speak, that's also known in the system as well. So when you're doing a transaction and you're doing it in Qi, you'd pay your fees in Qi. If you're doing it in Quai, you'd pay your fees in Quai.
Got it. Kishore asks, can Quai ever have a halving mechanism then?
So there kind of is a built-in mechanism wherein so I think the root of actually Kishore's question comes to proportionality. So there's a proportion, right? When we say, what's the block reward for Quai, what's the block reward for Qi, right? I didn't say equals to difficulty, I said proportional to difficulty. So there's technically two different proportionality constants. And those constants will be adjusting to maintain a point of stability. So in the system, with how sort of the game dynamics work, if you had 100% of the emissions in Quai, it's stable. If you had 100% of Qi emissions, it would be unstable. So you actually have to pick a control point on the relative emissions of Qi and Quai, and then adjust the proportionality constants appropriately in the mechanism. So they both have the input of difficulty. One uses the direct input, one uses the log of the input, but they also have their own sort of K coefficients that allow the exchange rate to float to try to target the control point of stability based off relative ratios of emissions, if that makes any sense.
And I guess I have a clarifying question, which is, two ledgers, so having UTXO and account doesn't necessarily mean two blockchains, right? So like there's still one consensus mechanism when you're mining, there's still one Quai network you're mining, there's still one node construction, all that sort of stuff, correct?
Yep, all that's correct. The address space is separated, so there's more sharding of the address space between Q and Quai, so that addresses don't get reused across the two systems, the same way that Cypress 1 is sharded from Cypress 2. So that, I guess, happens. The mempools are shared, the ordering in the block is shared, the consensus mechanism is shared. It's really just UTXO versus account and what goes with it. So again, I kind of think of it as a bank account and cash. So just like we have dollars and cents and coins, and then I also have a bank account You can kind of think of the system in the same way, where Quai would sort of function as your bank account and Chi would function as your cash.
And so to dig into that a little more, like what kind of scenarios do you think, would be optimal to use Quai for, and which scenarios are optimal for using Chi?
So basically, I think it's more optimal for most transaction types to happen in Chi, and then for most things that aren't strict transactions or cash-like to happen in Quai. So you could kind of think of it as the transactional economy versus the finance economy, right? And that's somewhat similar to what you achieve with both cash and bank accounts. So Quai being programmable, allowing the hypothecation of different assets and derivatives. There you go. That's effectively your DeFi land. And then if you're in Chi, right, it's stable. It's linked to, an objective real-world input, which is electricity. So its price should be somewhat tied to that input. And it should be much more readily stable than Quai. So if I'm trying to denominate goods and services, it's probably going to be much more easily done in Chi. And then if it's a service or a good like a pure leaf tea here, I'd probably denominate it in Chi, and I'd probably settle it in Chi because it'll be cheaper and easier to do it in the denominating unit.
I just want to clarify, when you say stable, you don't mean that there's no shocks to the system. You just mean that it will, it's always attempting to re-reach that equilibrium, right?
Yeah, that's right. So, I'm using the word that it's linked, that it's sticky, that it's stable, that the volatility should reflect in equilibrium. That of electricity, obviously the market, has to be responsive to be able to do that. And then, you have different sort of liquidity relations and sort of elastic supplies and responsiveness. So on any given second, right, it might not meet the equilibrium point, but over time it will trend towards that equilibrium point, we think, given the games that are put in place.
Got it. And then I have a final question from Kishore here before we can kind of wrap this thing up. But she asked, just to summarize, UTXO is a function of chain congestion, optimum fee spending, and atomicity in the case of Chi.
Yeah, and fungibility. Fungibility is a big concern for us.
Got it. And then I guess my final question before we close this out is, these presentations have been amazing, and I think to kind of give people a little bit of insight into what the general idea of the Quai Chi system is. Do you have any insight into when you think people will be able to dig more into the mathematics and the actual equations behind all these interactions and relationships?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's something we should get into the pipeline for sure, right? We've done internal modeling on it. Distilling it into a helpful format isn't the simplest thing to do. But yeah, definitely something that we want to do. So maybe in the new year, in January, if I have a little time over the break, we can put together something and have a call about it in January.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a good place to kind of close it out. I really enjoyed this presentation. I learned a lot from this one, and I hope everyone else in the call did too. We really appreciate everyone for joining and hanging out with us and learning about the new system. We're excited to share more information about it with you. Dr. K, thanks for your time, for the presentation. Again, this was a really good one. I had a good time. But yeah, again, appreciate everyone for being here, and We'll see you for the next one.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Max.